Hello there. Welcome to Just the Dis. We're talking about Blu-rays here. My name's Brian, and today I'm going to talk about some of the recent Warner Archive Blu-rays from the months of May and June. Warner Archive, a label I like very much, a label that, tends to focus their resources on the presentation of the film, not always on the extras. The extras are nice, but really, if you're looking for a great presentation, I can't say I've ever been disappointed with a transfer that Warner Archive has done. They really, really take this stuff seriously, and so I always appreciate that when I get a Warner Archive film, it's going to look very good. And, the focus, of course, there is on classic cinema. So a lot of these are classic titles. There is one 70s title I'll talk about here, but I'm going to start with a real favorite of mine, actually. This is The Clock from 1945, directed by Vincent Minnelli, starring, as you can see, Judy Garland and Robert Walker. And this film is just a wonderful, romantic, just sort of two people falling in love within a very short period of time kind of movie. I like to call it sort of like before sunrise, before sunrise, because that's sort of the vibe of the movie. And I would think that Linklater is probably a fan of this one, being that I know that Some Came Running is one he has called out as a definite favorite. That's also a Vincent Minnelli movie. Okay, so this one, just a very sweet film, a great New York film. It's about a soldier named Joe, played by Robert Walker, who arrives in New York from, I guess, boot camp, about to go off to war, has 2 days in New York, and finds himself sort of very lonely and asking people in Grand Central Station, like, what should I try and do in these 2 days? I don't even know what to do. He's so overwhelmed. And as he's seated by an escalator, sort of looking over a newspaper, I think trying to figure out what to do, he ends up tripping this young woman played by Judy Garland. Her name is Alice, and her heel breaks off of her shoe when she trips as she's trying to get on the escalator. She calls out to him. He, doesn't understand what's happening. He runs up to her. She's like, "Oh, you broke my heel." He's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand." He takes her to get the heel fixed, and then he sort of asks her, as he's been asking everyone, like, what do you recommend I do in the city? And here's my situation. And so he sort of asks her in a very inoffensive, he's just so innocent. He's so, he doesn't seem creepy. He just says, "Is it okay if she's going somewhere. I can't remember. He's like, "Is it okay if I walk with you?" And she's like, "Sure, whatever. Basically you seem inoffensive enough." So they walk together, and then she ends up getting on a bus, and he's like, "Is it okay if I ride with you on the bus? If not, no big deal," basically. And she's like, "Sure, whatever." So they're riding on a double-decker bus. They're in New York. He's looking around. He's just wide-eyed, and she tells him about Central Park, and he's like, "Oh, I'll have to go check out Central Park." And basically, it just becomes sort of a one thing after another. He sort of invites her along, and because they're having enjoyable conversation and enjoying getting to know each other, they go to Central Park. They, finally decide to split ways. And then very romantically, as she rides a bus away from him and he gives her like a lighter to sort of as a parting gift, he runs the bus down and says, because he asks if she, if she's busy tonight and she's got a date. And he runs the bus down and says, "Would you break that date?" And she says yes. And so then, they start hanging out through the night, and it's just a beautiful romance as they sort of talk to each other and find out more and more about each other and their hopes and dreams and such. And Judy Garland is just lovely in the film, and they're just a really great pair, and this is a period when Vincent Minnelli was working with Judy Garland. It's still an early film for him. It's one of like fourth or fifth films, but he's coming off Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944, which is a big hit and a big breakout for Judy Garland. And this is the time when Vincent Minnelli was starting to fall in love with her, and they would get together, I think around the time of this film. I'm not sure if it was on this film or just before. and of course, then they would have their daughter Liza, and so she's so beautifully photographed. It's through the eyes of a man falling in love with her, and so I think that makes the movie that much more, I don't know, sort of not believable, but it just gives it this air of like you can totally see why Robert Walker is falling for her, and it's just an incredibly sweet film. I just really, really love it. So I was really excited to see this get a Blu-ray. It looks wonderful, of course, black and white, 4:3. Has some features, vintage Pete Smith specialty short Hollywood Scout, classic cartoons, the Screwy Truant audio-only bonus, a radio show adaptation with Judy Garland and John Hodiak of the film. But yeah, this is a real all-timer for me, and highly, highly recommended if you like romantic films. It's one of my favorite romantic films. So that's The Clock. Then we jump forward to 1972 with The Carrie Treatment. This is a film I thought I had seen, but I didn't remember. It's directed by Blake Edwards and stars, as you can see, James Coburn and Jennifer O'Neill. And Coburn plays a doctor named Pete Carey. This is based on a novel by one Jeffrey Hudson, a.k.a. Michael Crichton, called A Case of Need. And so he's a pathologist, Pete Carey. He moves from, I believe, the West Coast to Boston to work at a hospital, and he meets up with an old friend of his, a doctor he'd worked with years before, played by James Hong, the great James Hong, who, of course, is in Everything Everywhere All at Once. He is Lo Pan from Big Trouble in Little China. He has had so many great roles. I met him once in person. He was an absolute delight, incredibly sweet guy. So they're friends, and soon after, the plot sort of starts to kick in. I mean, just to give you a sense of the kind of guy Carey is, he's sort of a progressive type, like he's not a buttoned up kind of doctor. He's the kind of guy who answers the phone like, baby, it's 4:00 in the morning, man. Like he's intelligent, but he's sort of like, he's hip, if you will. And he starts to fall for this dietitian played by Jennifer O'Neill at the hospital, and they sort of hit it off, but he's sort of a bachelor type. But so the plot really kicks in when this character, Karen Randall, who's the daughter of like the head doctor of the place, we see that she is brought into emergency and dies. And we find out that it's due to an illegal abortion and that something happened. And she told her mother 3 times before she died that it was James Hong's character that did this. And, the Coburn character talks to James Hong because he's arrested immediately for this murder. And he says, look, what happened, man? He's like, I didn't do it. He's like, I have done those sort of things because I've seen some horrible procedures gone wrong, some women treated very badly. And so I do it on occasion, but I only charge $25. I just for the lab fees and stuff. And so it's known that he does these things illegally, and that's one of the main reasons he's a big suspect. But Carrie doesn't believe that he did this, and he obviously says, I didn't do it. So then it becomes a mystery of like trying to find out what really happened to this girl. And so Peter Carey starts to neglect his job as a pathologist and sort of run around town trying to interview people that knew the girl. She was 15. And he sits in on the autopsy and, gets some samples that help prove whether or not she was actually pregnant. And so there's lots of little details, and he just sort of gets in deeper and deeper and gets himself more and more sort of in trouble with the head guy at the hospital, because despite it being his daughter and he's trying to solve the murder, there's clearly something going on that's being covered up. And he's really adversarial with this guy, like just right in his face, and it's pretty funny, actually. Pat Hingle plays like a cop who's like sort of investigating the case and is kind of like, hey, dude, watch yourself. But there's a lot. Carey has some questionable methods in terms of getting information out of people. But it's intriguing. And it's sort of this medical mystery thriller, along the lines of Coma, which Michael Crichton would direct in 1978, which was based on a Robin Cook novel starring Jean-Pierre Bujold and Michael Douglas and others. So those two would make an interesting double if you want a mystery medical thriller double from the 70s. This would go well with that. It is said that Carrie Treatment was heavily edited, like a few films that Blake Edwards did for Warner Brothers, and brought down to its hour and 41-minute running time. And apparently that phenomenon is addressed, or maybe specifically this movie is addressed, his experience with this movie, in his film S.O.B. In 1981, a satirical Hollywood comedy. But yeah, it's good. And if you like James Coburn, he's very solid in this. Jennifer O'Neill, very good. Also stars Dan O'Herlihy, Regis Toomey, John Hillerman shows up for a minute. And so it's interesting. It's an interesting 70s movie. That's Carrie Treatment. Then we have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1941. I want to say this is maybe the third adaptation of the Robert Louis Stevenson story novel. There's a 1920 version. There's the 1931 version with Frederick March, which I think is my favorite version. I'm hoping that with this coming out, they used to be a double on a DVD. You'd get this and the 31 together, and I'm hoping that means maybe we'll get the 31 at some point. Just some really great stuff in that. This one is interesting in that it's directed by Victor Fleming, who of course directed Gone with the Wind, one of the credited directors on Wizard of Oz. Also did films like Captains Courageous and Red Dust, which I like very much, as well as A Guy Named Joe, also with Spencer Tracy, who stars in this one, with Ingrid Bergman and Lana Turner. A Guy Named Joe would be adapted remade by Spielberg, as always, in the early 90s or late 80s. I can't remember. But Spielberg has definitely called out Victor Fleming as one of his favorite directors, and you can kind of see why. Like, he was a big studio filmmaker, but a good filmmaker, and so maybe sort of the Spielberg of his time in some ways. But anyway, this remake is good in that Spencer Tracy's very good, and I'm a big fan of Spencer Tracy. I know that, Richard Dreyfuss has mentioned being a big fan of Spencer Tracy, and obviously he's playing a Tracy character in Always. But Tracy's just a great actor, so he really sells this Jekyll and Hyde story, which of course is the story of a doctor in Victorian London who has some ideas about the separation of good and evil inside of mankind, and that, with the right drugs, I guess you could separate out the good side and let that go on and tamp down all the negative impulses we have, or vice versa, ultimately. And he's trying to marry an upper class gal played by Lana Turner, and her father is, they're about to be married, and her father is a little dubious of him because of his theories, which he thinks are, quote, harebrained. But the Dr. Jekyll character is very earnest about his beliefs in these sort of hypothetical, the research he's doing, basically. And it comes to a point where he actually takes his daughter away because Jekyll gets involved with this research, and Jekyll one night meets a barmaid with a friend of his, played by Ingrid Bergman, who's being assaulted by a guy, and they chase him off, and he takes her home, and she sort of makes a pass at him, and he sort of falls for it. And it's sort of like the idea that his more evil impulses sort of took over in that moment, and he never sort of forgets her. And then he has one guy that he's trying to do or he's thinking about using his experimental potion on, that he's been testing on rabbits and rats. And there's an interesting montage of that, experimentation. And so it's like he has this guy, and I think the guy dies, and so then he has to, decide, I guess I'll do it for myself. I guess I'll be the test subject, as we know this story. And then he becomes Dr. Hyde. He goes after the Ingrid Bergman character, and it's a dark movie. It's much darker than I remembered. There's a few things about it. The dream sequences that he has when he takes the drugs are almost Dali-esque. They're just bizarre and impressionistic and sexual in nature, more so than I remember. And the movie itself is very sexual for a film from 1941, in terms of what's, very much implied and what, you can tell is happening with some of the characters. So it's pretty dark in that sense, and I forgot about that. The other thing that's interesting to me is that the transformation to Dr. Hyde is a lot more subtle in this than it is in the 1931 version with Frederick March. The makeup in the 31, which is one of the reasons I love it, is just a very pronounced monster of a face. And in this version, the Mr. Hyde it's almost like his brow is protruding. It's almost like a caveman / werewolf face without the fur, but it's still very much Spencer Tracy's face. So it's an interesting, more subtle choice in that he can go out in public and seems like just a slightly odd looking dude and not a monster per se, although he is monstrous in his impulses and his mischievous, sort of thoughts and things that he does. And he does some really dark stuff too. So, but Ingrid Bergman is great in this. This is a year before she really breaks out in Casablanca in 1942. I had forgotten about this version of the film. Ultimately, and it's interesting again because of the cast. I think Lana Turner is great as always, and Bergman and Tracy, they're all really wonderful in the film. So it's definitely a very interesting adaptation of this story, and I'm glad to see it looking so good on this Blu-ray. I don't think the Carrie treatment, that doesn't have any features, and this one just has the trailer. Anyway, so that's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the 41. And then just a couple more here. We have Zigfield Girl with Jimmy Stewart, Judy Garland again, Hedy Lamarr, and Lana Turner again. And this one is directed by Robert Z. Leonard. I want to say it is from 1941 also. And it's about an elevator operator, the wife of a struggling concert violinist, a born-in-a-trunk vaudevillian. There are 3 different women on 3 different paths of life, yet they soon share one dream to become a Zigfield Girl. Lana Turner, Hedy Lamarr, and Judy Garland play the respective women trying for stardom in this sumptuous extravaganza. James Stewart adds to the star wattage, playing the jilted, truck-driving beau of Turner's footlights diva. A legendary innovator, Busby Berkeley, brings his imaginative camera work and pacing to the numbers that include Garland's massively scaled and calypso-infused Minnie from Trinidad, as well as a lavish showgirl review finale that reprises the rhapsodic "You Stepped Out of a Dream." Sweet dreams, movie fans. So you have some Judy Garland and Lana Turner crossover here, and some Busby Berkeley. I always love his stuff. Some of the greatest stylized musical sequences in films ever. And they always are highlights. And we have, for features, an introduction by Garland biographer John Fricke, vintage musical short, A New Romance of Celluloid, We Must Have Music, Our Gang short, Melodies Old and New, 2 audio outtakes, Too Beautiful to Last, and the deleted We Must Have Music finale, and a trailer. So that is Zigfield Girl. And then moving on to some more Busby Berkeley and some more Judy Garland, we have For Me and My Gal, which is from 1942. And it stars, of course, Judy Garland, Gene Kelly, and George Murphy. And this one, it says, after a late night cup of coffee, vaudevillians Joe Hayden and Harry Palmer, interesting, Harry Palmer, sit at a piano and work a song. Moments later, Joe realizes she's found exactly what she wasn't looking for, a partner. And with Judy Garland as Joe and Gene Kelly as Harry, the partnership isn't just a deal, it's a film fan's dream come true. Kelly debuts and Garland dazzles in the Busby Berkeley he directs this film, tale of song and dance pair who take on tank towns, tough times in World War I while struggling for showbiz success. A hit parade of era tunes paces the film, including the showstopper Ball and Jack and the sweetly harmonized title tune. Bursting with vitality and old-fashioned charm, For Me and My Gal is for the ages. This is one I haven't seen. I've always meant to see it. I'm a big fan of Busby Berkeley as a director and as, of course, choreographer and, musical sequence designer. This one has the commentary by Garland biographer John Fricke, 2 vintage musical shorts, La Fiesta de Santa Barbara and Every Sunday for Me and My Gal, deleted finale, and 3 cheers for the Yanks. Outtakes, photo recreations, audio-only bonuses, March 22nd, 1943, Screen Guild Players radio production starring Garland, Kelly, and Dick Powell, and Leo is on the air, radio promo, and a theatrical trailer. So another wonderful musical from the Warner Library, Judy Garland and Gene Kelly. So that will do it for this little update of Warner Archive titles. Definitely check out what they're doing, what they're announcing. There's constantly great stuff happening, between the classic film era, the 70s and the 80s. We've seen a lot of wonderful stuff this year, including Fandango, one of my all-time favorites. So between Fandango and The Clock, they're really ticking my favorite film boxes, and I'm quite delighted about that. So anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.